This sermon is a bit of a tough one for me personally. It's tough for a variety of reasons, partly because of the theme, partly because it's in the book of Daniel, and I'm not the world's biggest Daniel expert, partly because it's historical in nature, and I'm not the world's biggest historian either. But mostly it's because I am an American and I have a great fondness for the nation that I have spent the last 55 years in. And the idea of putting my nation in the spotlight, trying to examine it in a Daniel chapter 5 sort of context is a challenge for me. And I think it was challenging for anybody who's ever tried to do this kind of thing. It was no doubt challenging to Belshazzar as well when he heard the message originally. We don't like seeing ourselves in the historical spectrum. We don't like to see ourselves. It's very difficult for us to see ourselves as part of a historical narrative. It's easier for us to simply dwell on whether we're going to have enough money to pay the rent this month or something along those lines. But especially when a nation is successful, like Babylon was in times past, like the United States of America has been over the last couple centuries, it's important for us to give it a try. If we are people of faith, if we believe that there is a God in heaven who judges things, who oversees human history, who legislates and who judges and who ultimately condemns, it's important for us to not grow too complacent, for us to not become too comfortable with ourselves, because there is ample precedent in the Bible for God specifically condemning a nation because of its attitude, because of its behavior, because it did not measure up to his standards. And if there's a reason why he should make an exception to that rule for the United States of America, I don't know what would be. So the question is the handwriting on the wall for America? Is there doom and gloom in our future? Now, usually when we use the term handwriting on the wall, we mean the same thing essentially that it meant in Daniel's day. The Persian forces were literally at the door. The Babylonian Empire, for practical purposes, was just a few hours away from falling by the point that Daniel gives his prophecy here as the hand writes this message, this mysterious, terrifying message on the wall for Belshazzar the king. It was just right around the corner in the most literal of senses. And usually when we talk about the handwriting being on the wall, whether it's for your own personal challenges in life, whether it's for a nation, whether it's for your football team or whatever it happens to be, generally we're talking about a fait accompli, something that is finished for all practical purposes. We're just crossing the final T's, that sort of thing. And to that direction here, I don't want to suggest here that the question is America on the verge of falling? I don't see that there's any point in really pursuing that kind of question. God's timetable is God's timetable. The question at hand is, are we on the wrong path? Have we chosen a path for our nation that is inevitably, in time, going to destroy ourselves? Are we essentially just going through the motions at this point? Are we in a position that we are going to have a very, very difficult time coming back from? What I want to do is read Daniel chapter 5, or part of it anyway. We're going to just read the small section with regard to the actual message that Daniel gives, that God has given, and Daniel's interpreting here in Daniel chapter 5, and starting in verse number 25. Now this is the inscription that was written out. Daniel speaking to Belshazzar. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. And apologies for my Hebrew pronunciation. Obviously, it's terrible. This is the interpretation of the message. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found deficient. Perez, your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and Persians. Now, I am not an expert on ancient languages by any stretch, but I can read side notes with the best of them. And my Bible, perhaps yours as well, points out that there is an extended play on words that's being given in this message. These words that are written on the wall are references to Hebrew money, which are themselves derived from Hebrew words. The word mene is the same word that we get the word mina, or that the Hebrews rather got the word mina from. It means to number, to count. When he says here that your God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it, the idea is that he has looked at the Babylonian Empire and said, okay, you have a certain number of days, and now we're at the end of those days, essentially. Mina was 50 shekels, and shekel is the word that is derived from the second term that's used here, tekel. It means being weighed, to weigh is the idea here between tekel, and a shekel is the standard measure of money. A certain weight of gold is a gold shekel. And that when it says here that he has been weighed in the scales and found wanting, found deficient, basically you're saying, okay, here is a shekel worth of flour. Basically, the merchant is trying to sell you a shekel worth of flour. And the shekel weight is put in the other side of the two-pan scale, and you measure it out. And here is, therefore, a shekel worth of flour for you. But the shekel is wanting. The weight that is put in the pan is not as heavy as it should be. And so, therefore, justice isn't being served. This is a common trick in marketplaces in ancient times, and no doubt in the modern world as well. The weights are short. They're not going to sell you as much as you are thinking that you are buying. It's difficult to tell the difference between a pound of flour and 9/10 of a pound of flour. And a merchant over a period of months could save a lot of money that way, make a lot of extra money by selling less flour or whatever the good happens to be that's being weighed out. God clearly has an expectation for Babylon, and that expectation has not been met. And therefore, the third word, Perez, or upharsin, is the plural of it. The Perez refers to the half shekel, and the play on words is obvious there. The shekel's been cut in half, and the kingdom is going to be cut in half. This association of the Medes and Persians, this empire that has been built off to the east, that at this point Cyrus is at the head of, this association of these two different tribes is going to overthrow the Babylonians. And it's basically Babylon will be cut up like a shekel would be cut in half and given to two different nations. This is the message. This is the handwriting on the wall that is given to Babylon. God has expectations of you. You have not measured up to those expectations. And now there is going to be judgment. Now, the question is, for us, our application here today, are America's days numbered? And that is a complicated issue. If you want a simple answer, a straightforward one-word answer, the answer is yes. Now, I quickly follow up with that by saying that it is numbered, and we know that these days are numbered because all of us, our days are numbered. Every nation, the days are numbered. That's true for any human being. That's true for any group of human beings. James chapter 4 points this out, and many other passages as well. James chapter 4, verse 14. And this is, of course, an individual context, but I want to read it in a national sort of context, especially as an American, because we have a tendency to think that we're an exception to this, that we have been here, after all, for 200 plus years at this point. Everything seems to be going great. It's an extraordinarily stable governmental system. Even when you have knuckleheads and cheats and crooks and such in the halls of government, everything seems to work out in the long term. We recover, we come back. Very resilient. And the assumption is, of course, and I'm sure the Romans felt that too over 400 plus years that they hung in there. It's more like 600 or 700, I suppose. That they are immune to the winds of change, as it were. But human beings think that too. And human beings are wrong about that. James writes here, verse number 13, "Come now, you who say today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city and spend a year there and engage in business and make a profit. But you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. You are just a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and also do this and that. But as it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil." And going on to verse 17 also, "Therefore, to the one who knows the right thing to do and does not do it, to him it is sin." That's the individual, of course. An individual should not assume things that are not in evidence, especially when he's assuming things that cannot possibly be true. Assuming things that God has told him is not true, things that common sense, just a general perspective on history tells you are not true. We will go the way of the dodo bird one of these days. Every one of us will. And every other nation that has come up in times past has also died away. Some nations have kind of held on or changed forms or morphed or been absorbed or been dissipated or what have you. Certainly certain cultures have tended to survive, but the nations that we read about in the Bible, the nations that we have read about in our history books, Eastern civilizations, Western civilizations, they all come and go. Some of them are here, of course, but there is every reason to believe historically that these nations will fall as well. And that is a big part of the message of Daniel, really, as a whole. In Daniel chapter 2 and verse 44, after having seen this great vision, this dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, and Daniel interprets this dream, this image, this human image, represents human kingdoms. It represents all four of these world empires that were going to come up in this particular era of time. But really, even more than that, it's talking about human kingdoms in general and the superiority of God's kingdom that's going to be established in Jesus. This rock cut out of the mountain without hands is going to come down and crush these human demonstrations of power and prominence and success. Not in a military sense. We learn that from what Jesus says about his kingdom as time goes on. And as far as that goes, we'll learn it from history too. The church did not conquer the Babylonians or the Persians or the Macedonians or even the Romans. This was done by God. The superiority of God's kingdom, the superiority of Jesus, that's really what's being emphasized here. Human kingdoms come and go because humans come and go. That's one of the main messages, and Nebuchadnezzar had trouble understanding that. He had a wake-up call in chapter 4. If you read chapter 4 in the last couple of weeks, or if you've ever read it, you remember the story that Nebuchadnezzar lost his senses and was groveling around in the grass like an animal for a certain period of time, to teach him this lesson, that it's not all about you, that you do, in fact, come and go. You are where you are because God has placed you there. And it was true for Nebuchadnezzar. It was true for his empire. It's true for all of us, that our days are numbered. Now, I'm not suggesting here that the whole thing's going to be crumbling down in the next few years or in my lifetime. But if the world continues to stand, then at some point, something's going to happen. And the United States is going to go by the wayside like every other nation has. And I want to emphasize this a little bit because, again, this pride issue that you see in James chapter 4 rather, this idea that it can't happen to us, that it won't happen to us. I have seen that demonstrated. I have seen that preached, essentially, in so many words, many, many times by Christians, people who ought to know better, who say, in essence, that God is not able to save the world without the United States of America, that our industry, that our success, our capital, our reach, our innovation is so powerful and so pervasive that if we can't get the job done, then the job won't get done. Much of the premillennial philosophy centers around this kind of thing. There has been a lot of America equals God's kingdom sort of talk been thrown around for the last half century or so. A lot of religious bodies are essentially based on this, the idea that America is in place to accomplish this great good in the service of God, which is true, of course. All government is established for that purpose. But is it possible that America could go the way of the Roman Empire or the Macedonian Empire or the Babylonian Empire, and that the gospel could stand and the gospel could continue to spread and that souls could continue to be won? Isn't that the Bible message? Isn't that what we see over and over again in the book of Daniel and elsewhere also? That It's not just about how powerful we can get and whether or not we can turn that to God's advantage. It's not about us. It's about his message. And I find the use of money in this setting interesting. I'm curious whether God did this on purpose, because I kind of take away from this that the financial success, the economic success of the Babylonians is a rationale in the mind of Nebuchadnezzar before, and all the way down to Belshazzar by the time we get to chapter 5, a rationalization that we're too big to fail. We are too successful to fail, and we measure our success in dollars, like we always do in our culture or in shekels or what have you. It's not all about the money. And I wonder if that's one of the messages that Daniel is trying to get across here. You think that you have been very successful. Nebuchadnezzar thought it. Belshazzar thought it. He's looting temples here to grab a drinking glass. He's not satisfied just getting drunk out of regular drinking goblets. He wants to find temple goblets to drink out of and get drunk that way. Because you just have too much. You don't know what to do with all of this wealth that you have. How many times do we have that kind of conversation in our day with regard to America, that we are the greatest nation on earth, that we are more successful, more industrious, more free, however you want to measure it? The last, 100 years or so especially, it has become very much in vogue to talk about America in those kind of terms. And don't get me wrong, I'm very thrilled that America has been able to do the things that it has done over the years. But we do have a tendency to think, let me back up a little bit. I don't get into politics in this space very much, but I will confess this as far as this goes. My political leanings over the years have tended to be relatively conservative with regard to, well, not relatively conservative, very conservative with regard to economic matters and taxation and things like that. It has been drilled into my head for years by parents, by friends, by whatever, that the best thing that America can do for its citizens, and really by extension, the rest of the world as well, the best thing that America can do is provide a safe and effective economic environment where people can be free, people can do what they want to do, people can start their own business or go the way that they choose to go, and that we can empower them to do that, and they can find success in the things that they do, and that America is better at that than any other nation ever has been. And that is one of the big reasons, if not the biggest reason, why we are so much better and more successful, as we may define success, than all these other nations. And how wonderful it is that we are the United States, and what a horrible thing it would be if we didn't go down that road. And I'm not necessarily repenting of any of those philosophies here, but I do want to emphasize this, that when the Bible talks about government, the Bible doesn't talk about empowering individuals to do well in the flesh. And I will grant you part of that reason probably is because the Bible is not written in a democratic system. The New Testament is written in a system that is overseen essentially by the Romans. The Romans are a dictatorship for practical purposes with Republican roots, but by the time the New Testament is written, we're not talking about a republic anymore. There is an empire at this point. The emperor does whatever he feels like doing, maybe a little bit oversimplistic, but that's essentially what it is. And so therefore, it wasn't in position to help the little guy do really well. That wasn't a priority for the Romans, and so therefore the Bible doesn't talk about that kind of thing. Maybe if the Bible were written in the modern day, it would be written differently. We'll never know. I will grant that at least part of the lack of emphasis on democracy or rights or economic freedom or whatever may be because of the culture. That being said, the Bible says what it says. And if we believe that the Bible is adequate for all time, that the gospel was given once for all for the saints, Jude verse 3, that it is still adequate for every good work, for 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 16 and 17. If we have confidence that the Bible will empower individuals and empower government to know the way that it should go, give God's rules for life as we find our way to the next life, then we ought to listen to what the Bible says about what government does. And government is not measured in economic terms. Not typically, not in the Bible. In fact, economic terms are oftentimes used, maybe even usually used, to condemn a culture, to judge a culture, because that culture has become so successful and so proud of itself that it refuses to honor the God who made it all possible. What we see instead is an emphasis on allowing, for instance, 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, the idea of praying for peace, peaceable situations where we can be allowed to practice our religion freely. It's something that we have always had in this nation, thankfully. That is a good thing. Other nations have it maybe to a lesser degree, maybe to the same degree. I'm not a world historian here. I'm not in a position to judge what nations are doing well or what nations are not doing well, or even that our nation could be doing better or worse. But this is what we ought to be praying for. We ought to be praying that we be allowed to be Christians. That's what government's job is, to create a peaceable environment, an environment where we are not at war with ourselves, or whenever possible, not at war with anybody else either. Justice is described in Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 4. You know the text there where we're supposed to submit to government. And this is the Roman government, again, a government that doesn't necessarily love its citizens or love its conquered peoples. But we submit to this government anyway, and we acknowledge that government has the right and the responsibility to exercise condemnation, to exercise judgment and punishment against ill-doers, against bad actors. And if you don't want to fall afoul of that kind of government, then don't act badly. You do the things that God has told you to do, and do the things that the government has told you to do when you can, in harmony with God's will for your life. And then you trust that God's going to take care of you by way of your government. Sometimes it doesn't work out that way. Sometimes God has other plans, and you read the New Testament, you see that over and over again, that sometimes we do suffer, sometimes even at the hands of government. But those governments are held accountable for that. And many governments have been destroyed because they did not do that, including the nation of Israel, because they did not measure up to God's standards. They were put in the scales and found wanting. I was reading in Ezekiel in the last few weeks. We covered Ezekiel in our reading through the Bible this year. And I was looking back at Ezekiel chapter 27 and 28 at the condemnation of the nation of Tyre and the prince of Tyre that's described here, clearly the head of the government, as it were. And some have suggested there is a demonic force behind this also. It's not just this one particular potentate that is being condemned. It's the spiritual forces behind him. And I don't doubt that, at least to a certain degree, that is true. I also don't doubt that there are other nations that fall under the same condemnation because they also feel too highly about ourselves. And I tried in my mind to put the United States of America into this context here and see how it fit. And it was a little disturbing, I'll be perfectly honest with you. It fit way too well in my mind. I'll read a small portion of it here in chapter 28 and verse 1. The word of the Lord came to me saying, Son of man, say to the leader of Tyre, thus says the Lord God, because your heart is lifted up, and you have said, I am a God. I sit in the seat of gods, in the heart of the seas. Yet you're a man and not God. Although you make your heart like the heart of God, behold, you're wiser than Daniel. There is no secret that is a match for you. By your wisdom and understanding, you've acquired riches for yourself, and have acquired gold and silver for your treasuries. By your great wisdom, by your trade, you have increased your riches, and your heart is lifted up because of your riches. Therefore, says the Lord your God, verse 6, because you have made your heart like the heart of God, therefore, behold, I will bring strangers upon you, the most ruthless of the nations. They will draw their swords. Basically, Tyre is going to fall as we go on here. And in this culture where we have all these debates and treaties and such that emphasize free trade, that this has been one of the linchpins of foreign policy in the United States. Either we're for it or against it. But we are a land of merchants. We trade things. We buy things and sell things. We make things and distribute things. And overseas we do these things. Now, obviously, this is not talking about the nation of the United States, and I'm not suggesting here there's some kind of hidden message for us here. But I am saying this, that it's possible for us to think of ourselves, and if you're not in the United States, you can probably put your nation in here as well. Think so highly of ourselves, to think that we are completely masters of our own destiny, that we are in charge of the world, that we are in charge of setting up the bowling pins and knocking them down. We may stop short of calling ourselves gods, because these days, God of any sort is a subject you're not really supposed to talk about. And so maybe it's not politic for us to call ourselves as the United States of America a God. But doesn't it amount to the same kind of thing? Assuming, like going back to James chapter 4, that we have control over our destiny, that we're going to do this and we're going to do that. I always get a chuckle out of these politicians that announce these 10-year plans. We're going to balance the budget in 10 years. We're going to have economic independence in 10 years. We're going to be energy efficient and energy independent in 10 years, or this long extended period of time, when they know perfectly well, and any intelligent observer knows perfectly well, you can't establish a policy over a 10-year period in the United States. If you were in an empire, if you were the Romans, then maybe you could. But that's just not the way our system works. We claim this credit for ourselves, that we have the ability to govern our future completely. And if we don't do it, it's just because we aren't working hard enough, or because we have the wrong policy, the wrong people are in office, and with a little bit of tweaking, we can make this work. That is arrogance on our part. And it's arrogant for Democrats, it's arrogant for Republicans, it's arrogant for independents, all of us, thinking that we can somehow, because of our own actions, be the kind of nation that we ought to be, independent of God's expectations, independent of God's judgment. It's arrogant. And the arrogance of nations has brought them down over and over again. And to answer my own question, I fear that God has similar judgment with regard to the United States. Now, what can we do about that? There's probably nothing that we can do, quite frankly, about that. If this sounded like some kind of call to elect a better president or a better Congress or whatever, you missed the whole point. That's exactly the opposite of what I'm saying. What we need to do as people is get away from the idea that it's all about building the best nation we possibly can. I'm not opposed to building a great nation. And if you have opportunity to go to the ballot box or what have you and build a great nation, then by all means do so. We'd rather live in a strong nation than in a weak one. I'd rather live in a moral nation than an immoral one. If we have power in that regard, by all means, let's go that way. But thinking that it's all about fixing this country so that this country can fix the world, that's a very flawed, very arrogant notion. We need to back way, way, way away from that. What we need to do as the people of God is be ourselves the kind of Christians that we ought to be God's servants, we ought to be God's people, and pursue his things, and not see this nation as a tool in his hand so much to accomplish things, although to a certain degree I suppose it is, but rather see us as part of history, as yet another way in which God has demonstrated his power, his will, his authority over human beings. Another opportunity, maybe a little bit different, for people to approach him, to draw close to him, to establish a relationship with him. And maybe the government can help, or maybe the government can hinder. But ultimately, it's our choice. Again, answering the question here, is the handwriting on the wall? I think a better question is, where's your soul? Is the handwriting on the wall for you? Have you predetermined a path for your life that is taking you in the wrong direction? You don't have a lot of control over which direction the United States of America or any other nation is going to go. But if we are Daniel, for instance, in this foreign land, in this world that is contrary to the things of God, if we can hold fast to our faith, if we can trust in him regardless of who the power is, regardless of how strong or how weak our nation is, regardless of whether the powers that be are on the way up or on the way down or on the way out, If we can trust in God, if we can be Daniel, be culture warriors, not fighting for a system or fighting for a plan or fighting for a government, but fighting for our souls, fighting for the Lord. If we can do that, if we can trust in Him, then we can find that there is, in fact, handwriting on the wall, handwriting in a book, if you prefer to use the term from Revelation, that there are things written down with regard to us that are etched in stone, or at least, permanently etched, strongly etched by the hand of God Himself, that He is determined to save us. And as long as we hold true to His will, we hold true to His principles, God can and will deliver us out of this sinful world, regardless of what kind of circumstances or what kind of government may be in power. He can and He will save us and establish a much better system for us in eternity. But the key, of course, is to reject alliance to physical kingdoms in preference to an alliance with His spiritual kingdom. Be a citizen of the United States. Be a citizen of whatever nation you're in. That's not a problem necessarily. But ultimately be a citizen of heaven. Philippians 3 verse 20. Put your true citizenship there. Put your true loyalty there. Put your true commitment there. And allow God to ultimately bring you home. I hope and pray that this is a blessing to you. I hope that you can take a lesson from Daniel and draw closer to God and say a prayer for our government, say a prayer for the governments of the world so that good circumstances may prevail, that peace may reign, and that we be free to serve God as He has wished. And in any case, that we have the courage to deal with our circumstances and go where He would have us to go. Thank you very much for listening. God bless.